I think we are all in the room. A few more people still to arrive, but it's just 5:05 and our start time was 5, so I'm going to kick things off and welcome you to the second of 5 days in this online conference with the heading Reactionary Digital Politics, Ideologies, Rhetorics and Aesthetics. It's really great to welcome you back, some of you today too, and to welcome some new people as well. Our topic today is mapping online extremism and the far right. Before I introduce our speakers, I'm just going to give you a little bit of the background of the project and what it is that we're trying to do this week. So this conference, this event, is the closing event of a 3-year research project supported by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK called Political Ideology, Rhetoric and Aesthetics in the 21st Century, the Case of the Alt-Right. So that project was about, on the one hand, trying to make sense generally of how digital communication was changing the way people do politics, experience politics, communicate it, try and persuade and bring people over to their cause, but also to think specifically about how digital technologies were using and being used by actors on the political right, because it seemed to us there was a lot of things and churn and shift and things going on online that needed to be understood, and needed to be understood by bringing together people who specialize in thinking about digital media and media practices and communication systems and the industries that govern media platforms, but also people who knew about the political theory, the history and the ideologies of these kinds of movements, people who could think about the rhetoric and the ways in which people were presenting themselves online, and people who could think about the strategies and tactics that these groups were using, what was new and what was different, and what was old and what was being revived by them. So we've been trying to bring different people together to think about all these kinds of issues in a very kind of rounded sort of a way. And that's what we've been doing we'll be doing this week. We're trying to bring together scholars who can cover that range. We've got historians and media specialists, political theorists, rhetoric specialists, and people who study these movements on the ground. And we'll bring them together to have conversations, to share their understanding and their thinking, to debate and discuss what's going on with each other, with us from the project, and with you who are a part of our audience. Last night we had an excellent discussion between scholars about some of the history and development of these movements, the political theory and ideology underpinning reactionary right-wing politics right now. This evening we're going to look in more detail at the contemporary far right and some of the related extreme movements, but also how they fit into the bigger picture of the way politics is changing in itself, but also in connection with the use of digital media. We're going to think about how some of these movements are reanimating old tactics, the new tactics that are being developed, how that's understood and misunderstood, and also perhaps touch on how these are intersecting with other things we'll find online, QAnon, conspiracy activity, anti-vaxxing, and how that's becoming articulated with and to these kinds of causes. So who do you bring along when you've got the opportunity to get anyone from all over the world to do this? Well, you bring along the people that I'm about to introduce to you. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Matthew N Lyons. Matthew's going to be our first speaker. He's been studying and writing about politics on the far right for many, many years. He wrote, I think, a key essay early on in a seminal collection called Control, Alt, Delete, an anti-fascist report on the alternative right in 2017. He's also the author of Insurgent Supremacists, the US Far Right's Challenge to State and Empire, another key text in this area. He's written for news and politics outlets all over the world and is a regular contributor to the extremely interesting and helpful anti-fascist website, Three-Way Fight. And then we're going to hear from Bethan Johnson. You can see Bethan here. Bethan is a historian. She's also head of strategic planning and advancement at the Centre for the Analysis of the Radical Right. So in her work, she's examined, on the one hand, the Cold War ideological foundations of ethno-nationalist movements, the history of them in Western Europe and North America, but is now also looking at following that through to look at contemporary manifestations. She's written academic articles on the history of the far right and also published in venues like Open Democracy, talking about what's going on and happening now, and does lots of excellent contributions to the website of the CARR. Then we will hear from Annie Kelly. So Annie is a researcher and journalist specialising in the study of online anti-feminism and conspiracy. She received her PhD on misogynist movements online from University of East Anglia, where I work. There was nothing to do with me. She was all her own work. And she's written for newspapers all over the world, including the New York Times. She's currently the UK correspondent for the QAnon Anonymous podcast, and is, I've just learned, developing her own podcast looking at the history of vaccines and vaccine politics. And then lastly, we will hear from Alexandra Minna Stern, the historian, and the Carol Smith Rosenberg Collegiate Professor in the Department of American Culture at the University of Michigan, where she also holds appointments in the Departments of History, Women's Studies, and Obstetrics and Gynecology. So she's written a very important, very interesting history on eugenics and sterilization in the United States, looking at 4 particular states, published in the book Eugenic Nation, Faults and Frontiers of Better Breeding in Modern America. And most recently, another essential text for those interested in this area, Proud Boys in the White Ethnostate, How the Alt-Right is Warping the American Imagination. So you can see why we chose these people to come and have this conversation with each other and with you. I think it's going to be a fascinating and very educational, informative discussion. And with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Matthew to start.
Thank you, Alan. And thank you to all of the organizers of this event. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with everybody, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I want to give a few kind of quick general comments about recent developments in the US far right, both during the Trump presidency and in the months since Donald Trump left the White House. Before I do that, I want to say just a little bit about my analytic framework. When I use the term US far right, I'm talking about a set of movements defined by 2 things. First, these are movements that embrace human inequality as something that's supposedly natural or desirable or inevitable. And second, these movements reject the legitimacy of the existing US political system. And I don't intend this definition to apply for all times or places, but really specifically for understanding the far right in the US in this historical period. And I think this definition of the far right does a couple of things. First, it emphasizes that the far right encompasses multiple ideologies because different branches of the far right focus on promoting different forms of inequality. White nationalists, for example, focus on race and promoting a system where people of color are not just subordinated, but more or less completely excluded. But other far right currents don't address race explicitly or don't focus centrally on race at all because they put other forms of inequality at the center of their politics. The theocratic Christian right is concerned with enforcing gender inequality first and foremost, I would argue. The patriot movement includes white supremacist and theocratic influences, but its unifying theme, I would argue, is about enforcing inequality based on individual property rights. In talking about the far right, it's important that we look at the full range of these kind of ideological currents and the political roles that they play, rather than focus only on racial politics or only on explicit white supremacism. My definition of the far right also emphasizes that its movements have a contradictory relationship with the established order in the United States. On the one hand, they're about reinforcing and intensifying the systems of social hierarchy and dominance that have always been at the heart of US society. But on the other hand, far rightists want to bring about dramatic political and social change because they believe that the existing political system has failed to protect traditional systems of power and privilege. Far rightists believe that sinister elites are actively working with or orchestrating movements to overturn traditional hierarchies, and therefore these elites must be overthrown and the political system must be radically overhauled. Donald Trump's political rise had a dramatic effect on the US far right. As presidential candidate and as president, Trump developed a symbiotic relationship with the far right, unlike any previous president. And the specifics of this relationship evolved over time. In 2016, the alt-right played a significant role in boosting Trump's candidacy through skillful online activism. And in return, the Trump campaign helped the alt-right get a lot more visibility and recognition and public validation than it would have achieved on its own. In 2020, we saw patriot movement groups, Proud Boys, and other far rightists carrying out a wave of physical attacks, including murder against Black Lives Matter protesters. And this wave of violence symbiotically complemented Trump's fear-mongering and vilification of the Black Lives Matter movement. Trump served as a rallying figure, someone who could bring together diverse and competing far-right currents, although some far-rightists never supported him or came to regard him as a sellout or a traitor. Even more important, Trump made the barrier between the far-right and mainstream politics much more permeable than it had been before. Far-right ideas flowed into the mainstream and to some extent became state policy, while people shifted from mainstream politics into far-right politics. These effects increased dramatically over the past year as Trump increasingly called into question the legitimacy of the electoral process and sought to undermine that process so that he could stay in power. After November 3rd, Trump's false and baseless claim that the presidential election had been stolen was embraced by tens of millions of people. Tens of millions of mainstream Trump supporters rejected the validity of the voting process, which is the foundation for the whole US political system, and thus aligned themselves with far-right politics, at least temporarily. That large-scale shift powered the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, which was a broad-based attempt to overturn the results of the election by force. And the January 6th attack, in turn, helped to galvanize the far-right and sharpen battle lines. Since Donald Trump left the White House, the US far-right has entered a period of regrouping, assessing the new situation, and developing strategies to address it. Some far-right forces have experienced a crisis. For example, some local Proud Boys chapters split from the national organization when it was revealed that Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio had worked as a police informer. And many QAnon supporters had a crisis of faith when their movement's predictions that Trump would miraculously stay in office failed to come true. Other far-right groups have thrived, such as Ammon Bundy's People's Rights Organization, a rising force within the Patriot movement, which has done skillful grassroots organizing around fears of COVID-19 public health measures encroaching on freedom. Perennial disagreements about political strategy are reasserting themselves. Some factions, such as the Groypers, a white nationalist group led by Nick Fuentes, are trying to build a far-right presence within the Republican Party and the conservative movement. Others are sharpening their opposition to the state, and some, notably the Boogaloo Boys, have carried out killings and other violent attacks against police. But we're also seeing new convergences between different far-right currents, such as growing ties between the Patriot movement and the New Apostolic Reformation, a large and powerful theocratic network within the Christian right. Part of the context for these developments is how the two major parties are dealing with the aftermath of Trump's presidency. Trump remains hugely popular within the Republican Party, which helps create openings for those far-rightists, such as the Groypers and New Apostolic Reformation, who want to subvert the party from within and replace business-oriented conservatism with their own supremacist ideologies. Whether this pushes the Republican Party into direct conflict with the political system or co-opts far-rightists into renewed loyalty to that system, the results could be highly dangerous. The dynamics with the Democratic Party are different. President Biden and his allies, with support from the security agencies, are promoting a struggle against so-called domestic extremists on both the right and the left, a framework that falsely equates fascists and anti-fascists, racists and anti-racists. This centrist framework fuels the growth of the repressive state apparatus, which inevitably comes down harder against oppressed communities and the left than it does against the right. In this context, some far-rightists, notably the Boogaloo movement, are trying to form alliances with leftists against the state, while other far-rightists dismiss the left as adjuncts of the Democratic Party and present themselves as the only opponents of state repression and the only real advocates of meaningful change. So there is a continuing need for community-based initiatives that combat the far right while rejecting state repression, and that work to dismantle the systems of oppression and exploitation that far right politics grow out of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Absolutely perfect on time and a fantastic introductory overview of what we're thinking about. And that opening point you made about inequality being the core, that came up last night, interestingly, as how what galvanizes a lot of these movements is this understanding of natural equalities that must be reasserted. And I think you're right to have us looking and thinking, how are they organizing around that? How can they unify? Thank you very much. I'd like to move then on to Bethan so that we can hear Bethan's perspective on these matters.
Great. Let's see if my technological skills are what I think they are at any given moment. So hopefully people can see this.
Yep.
My presentation. Oh, fabulous. And much like was just said, I want to open by thanking the organizers of not just this panel discussion, but the entirety of these several days and the project that they're doing more generally, for doing this investigative work into what is such a timely, unfortunately, as such a timely issue around the world, really. It's my strong belief that collective sort of inattentiveness and negligent passivity has been essential in allowing these ideas to really grow and sort of metastasize. I often compare the ideology that I study to that of something of a cancer, kind of poisonous idea that when left untreated is able to multiply much more rapidly and spread from a very distinctive location sort of out into the world more generally. And so basically, I'm going to look at accelerationism, which is a subset within the radical right or the far right. So it's, I would argue, at the most extreme end in many ways of that. I'll explain sort of what it is and why, but again, to give a bit of an overview as to the framework that I use, or what I'm really talking about if I say radical right today. I'm talking about accelerationism and this issue of like how it proliferates and potentially why. So we can see we're really very familiar with the overt expressions, for instance, of the radical right and radical right terrorism. These are faces that many of us will recognize across time, and some of the names as well. And unfortunately, we are less familiar with the victims of their violence, but we are familiar with them and their names. I would say that this expression, as we see it now, if you want to use wave theory, but even if you don't, we're going through what might be called a wave or a new wave of radical right terrorism of a particular milieu. And that has largely been dated around 2010, 2011, 2011 being obviously when Anders Breivik perpetrated his attacks in Norway, and the publication of his work, 2083 as well. And actually in the subsequent decade, we've seen a dramatic rise in the violence perpetrated by people who embrace racist, misogynistic, homophobic, among many other belief systems. And so basically, just to actually throw some numbers in there, and I'm never one to throw numbers around, but I guess I have to on occasion, just for people to understand the extent of this issue. In North America, Western Europe, and Oceania, radical right attacks have increased by more than 250% since 2014. And the fatalities resultant from such attacks has increased by 709%. So not only is there more violence, but that violence is increasingly fatal in nature. And beyond this, we can think about hate crimes as another expression of this. People often forget to connect those things, but using the UK, which is where I'm from, as an example, hate crimes linked to race have more than doubled between 2011 and 2018, and they've more than quadrupled with regards to religiously motivated hate crimes in that same time period. So we really are seeing a sort of boon of things. And in particular, I would say, and this is probably because it's a project of mine that I've been working on and will continue to work on, is a concern about young people as the sort of next frontier of this. And we'll talk about why that is and what's allowed these groups to do that as we're talking about the online space. But really, there's a large amount of concern, rightly so, in global recruitment of young people to these kind of ideas. And I'll mention some of that, but if people have more questions about youth in particular, or young boys in particular, the question and answer period is a time when I can try to get into that, or subsequently. But these are just some headlines that I pulled from various journals and newspapers across the world in the last just 2 years, I think, that are talking about this issue. And so then we come to accelerationism as a philosophy. And that is actually what's driving a large amount of this violence and the recruitment that's going on when people talk about white supremacism and neo-Nazism and terrorism. They are looking at expressions of a political philosophy that we call accelerationism. Now, this is a pulled quote from, and screen grab, I guess, from American History X, which is set prior to what is often dated as the sort of beginning of the proliferation of accelerationism. And it's not a perfect example, but this idea, this I believe in death, destruction, chaos, filth, and greed, that sort of negative connotation, that desire for a chaotic, semi-anarchistic future is something that is essential to accelerationism as a political philosophy. And so it's important to recognize that accelerationism has been around for a while, but it is increasingly popular in nature. And it's given this name, we've given it this name recently. And there are some reasons why it's sort of caught the attention of so many people, and we can talk about that in the Q&A as well, if we would want. But just to sort of highlight the beliefs of accelerationism, essentially it's a belief system that is fundamentally reliant upon the idea that Western liberal democratic governments and society more generally, are built on faulty logic. The idea that people are equal, or even the recognition of certain communities as human, is faulty. That the values of egalitarianism or meritocracy, equity, are inherently unnatural. And because of this, eventually, these societies are going to break down. And the point of the violence that they perpetrate is to accelerate the breakdown of these Western liberal democracies. And they're doing this because they believe that at the top of the pyramid, as it were, is white, heterosexual, cisgender males who will assume power in this structure and sort of either enslave all of the non-white peoples or exterminate some of them. It depends on the community that they're talking about. But the violence that they're basically hoping to perpetrate is one that is terrorist in orientation and is designed to instill fear in people. So they basically think that if they can have a cascading event of terror or terrorist attacks in quick succession, that people will either lose faith in their government and take up arms themselves to fight each other, and societies will break down along racial lines. And because white people are, to their mind, inherently superior, they will triumph in the race wars, or that the government itself, by overreacting to white nationalist or white supremacist terrorism, will oppress white people to the point where white people will revolt and take power. And again, the end result is the same, the assumption of a fascistic racial hierarchy in which white people are placed at the top. But it is one that's extremely reliant upon the use of terrorism in there. And so you're talking about genocide and other things. And so where do we find this? We find this in written work, that's sure. We see it in Siege, we see it in manifestos, but unlike previous generations where you are seeing things put out in newsletters and other spaces, now it's really moved to the online sphere. It's much harder to track, for instance. It can spread much farther. So these are some of the sites, not all of them, that these groups are using to share their ideology. And really, it has allowed for, in my opinion, this explosion of these belief systems. So you actually see people going from more mainstream platforms like Facebook, even Twitter, they move to 4chan, 8chan, Reddit, and then to Gab and to Discord and other places to closer to encrypted sites. And they use this to communicate with one another and to propagate their ideas. So it's really easy to find these belief systems online. And so there's like a culture around all of this now. So they're communicating the ideas, they're sharing Siege and other works on there that are ideologically appealing to people. So they're making arguments. But then aside from that, you've got the images. And I think the images are really important. I don't have a huge amount of time to talk about them, but these are just a couple. Some of these are pulled from a new work that came out last week. But you can sort of see that they're trying to capture the imagination of viewers. So now, unlike before, where it was mostly just reading, the online space has allowed people to really make this a multifaceted visual cultural element as well. And that's a pretty dangerous thing, but they have some sort of norms within their practices in the online sphere. So sort of Nazi colors, great amount of violence, quite graphic. So aside from the humorous meme and lol culture that we see, you see this is the most extreme end. And it's incredibly graphic. It's an incredibly eye-grabbing. And so just quickly, why might these kinds of things appeal? And they're particularly appealing to young people, but they speak to general concerns that people are having in society. About isolation now in COVID, but also just feelings of not fitting in or being bullied. They really like individuals who feel isolated, who have fewer relationships, so they might be able to take up violence more quickly. And again, COVID creates a particular problem because we're not experiencing diverse society in the same way. And so they're really doing well in this moment as we are turning inwards. And I would say also, particularly with youth, they're being recruited because they are super tech savvy. They're able to go on these spaces in ways that maybe their parents or grandparents or guardians can't see. So the online space is really important for them as a whole. But generally speaking, accelerationism is growing because of the internet. And as much as tech companies have tried to get things off of their platforms, it's incredibly difficult. And I would say that those that have taken the other position, this sort of free speech position, are the ones that have allowed this to sort of carry on and to spread in really dangerous ways as well. And I think that I'll just close out by saying that really, we don't know what we're going to look at when we come out of COVID one day. I think really we need to be paying a lot of attention to how the cyberspace is changing and growing. There's so much more content that's being put out now, and people are more amenable than ever. So works like this conference and other things are really critical in helping prepare us to come out of COVID and deal with what might be a much more virulent and much larger community than we ever thought. But that's all I have to say. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bethan. That was super interesting, super helpful in kind of homing in on that strand of accelerationism, but also crucially showing how that's able to amplify itself through this particular technology. And that point about the imagery is really important. It also lets me plug tomorrow's event, which is on the rhetoric and aesthetics of these movements and how that's part of what they use to draw people in. Thank you very much. And I'm sure there will be questions about what you said. But I'd like to throw over to Annie right away, who's been looking at these movements in detail too, and actually kind of going to demonstrations and finding out what's going on. And maybe she'll tell us some of that. So Annie.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. Yeah, I'm Annie Kelly. I'm a researcher and now a journalist of the far right and a former PhD student at UEA. And my thesis looked at a very specific time. It looked at digital anti-feminist sites from 2012 to 2016. And when I say looking at, I understand it's a little vague, but I sort of more specifically mean I analysed the use of discursive strategies in those spaces to try and break down some of their widespread appeal. And I think that's still quite an important thing to do, because I can sometimes get very frustrated with how we can accidentally almost naturalize the appeal of something like the far right or digital anti-feminism. And I do think that sort of plays into their hands a little bit. So I try and talk more about kind of strategies and yeah, I suppose kind of branding and marketing, not to sort of imply that, you know, everybody using these is kind of conscious and aware that they're manipulating people, but more to sort of try and denaturalize their popularity, essentially. So I looked at digital anti-feminism, but obviously most of the people here today will be aware of another phenomenon that was happening at the same time, which sort of forced my thesis to kind of confront that fact, which was the emergence of a coherent and confident far-right digital network, which is sometimes referred to as the alt-right. I'm aware it's not a perfect term. I know lots of people dislike it, but I think it's useful for me insofar as it means I don't have to keep on saying the far-right digital network. And I think it does actually distinguish the primarily digital medium of the network and how that's impacted on the style and the content it produces as well. So as you can probably tell, in my opinion, these two phenomena, the popularity of digital anti-feminism and the rise of the alt-right, are not coincidental, but are actually directly intertwined with one another. And I think the anti-feminist digital network tried out some strategies which really directly influenced and in many cases directly evolved into the far right. So today I want to focus on some examples of influence that I wrote about in my thesis. It's not a complete list. It's going to be necessarily brief, but if there's anything that's vague, then, or you're not sure what I mean, then we can please ask me in discussion. I'm happy to go over it. So what do I mean by discursive strategies? So for the purposes of this paper, we're going to look at two different types of strategies, one of which I'll just call influence strategies and one which I'll call persuasion strategies. So persuasion strategies would just be the ones that we use in everyday conversation when we're just trying to bring a person around to our point of view. Although obviously online that has a slightly different format. So frequently online, for example, it's not aimed at one specific person in conversation, but casting a wide net, essentially trying to persuade a lot of people. Influence strategies, on the other hand, are how on an internet of, seemingly infinite content, sites or figures will try to gain a foothold in the attention economy, to be noticed, to grab people's attention, to make an impact, in short. Now, they're obviously going to relate to one another. There's a reason that influencers in the more traditional sense get brand sponsorship deals and stuff like that, because companies understand that they can make them buy a product. But those marketing companies, often have a bit of an easier job of quantifying how well it works. They can look at sales figures. That's more difficult when you're doing what I'm doing, which is trying to figure out how it actually impacts on people's points of view, or ideology. Even when you do interviews with people, it's still methodologically difficult to make any kind of definitive claims for how much a particular strategy altered or reinforced their ideology as they came across it. But for influence, there is a bit more evidence out there. We can use tools like the Internet Archive, social media analytics, and that sort of thing to kind of roughly address what kind of reach we think an example has had. We can research a relatively extensive timeline on anti-feminist sites, forums, and users, and basically see how many of them copied a strategy, which can be quite a good way of sort of checking how successful they at least believed it to be at the time. So now that I've sort of got that definitional stuff out of the way, I want to talk about some anti-feminist discursive strategies that I've found to be most effective, in my opinion, in terms of influencing the alt-right or digital far-right. And the first of these I want to talk about is social media and cross-site networks, because I think this one is probably the most influential on the next strategies I want to talk about. So bear with me, I've got a little bit of a cold. I mentioned in the beginning, I'm looking at 2012 to 2016. And the reason for that is because that's when it broadly covers the move from semi-isolated blogs and forums, both of which lacked some really useful affordances, which were necessary for wide-scale recruitment, to social media. And that had a real shift on not just the growth and the spread of those ideologies, but also their content as well. So the kind of affordances that social media gives you are, for instance, easily accessible community structures, which on blogs would only ever be able to play out below the line, so to speak. So discussions necessarily constrained to what someone's brought up in that article. News and events are only able to be relayed at the editorial pace. Image boards like 4chan, on the other hand, had almost the opposite problem. There's no editorial or moderation standards, constant flow of content, because it's 4chan, much of it is deliberately grotesque and unwelcoming to newcomers. And similarly, I think the community-forced anonymity and idiosyncratic rules of etiquette make it sort of confusing and hostile for newcomers, which isn't great if you're trying to recruit people. So we see a movement from here, from these blogs and from image boards to sites with initially lax censorship policies like Reddit and YouTube, and then social media sites with a much, much wider reach like Facebook and Twitter. And this allowed a much better organized and connected network to emerge. Users could and did move from one site to the other via hyperlinks, comment sections. Twitter was particularly useful because it allowed for these collectivized surge goals like hashtag campaigns, most notably, I think, with Gamergate in 2014, which was the most successful one. But the use of social media tools like video had effect on not just the movement, but the content of the ideologies themselves. So on YouTube in particular, a lot of figures in the network have been really successful in styling themselves as entertainment rather than politics. They use sort of colorful characters and memes and irony and all of this sort of stuff. And it links to another influence strategy, which is gamification, utilizing social media tools in order to make online discourse more like a video game. You're collecting likes, your point scoring, you're crowdsourcing. The immediacy and the regular algorithmic slippage of content output on all of these sites expanded their audience base from which to recruit from. It also allowed for much greater resistance against site bans, which happen more and more regularly once there's greater awareness and public pressure around things like incel, terrorism, and alt-right potential for violence and these sorts of things. So essentially, you can get banned from one platform, but you still have, you know, however many followers on another, and it's quite easy for you to kind of get around and circumvent these things. Now I'm going to talk a little bit on some persuasion strategies. Once the influence strategies have worked, you've been influenced to kind of check out a site, check out a forum, see what's going on. What makes you stay there? You're talking about the internet, which, as I said, is infinite options. I've seen some studies that say the digitally native user bases have much smaller attention spans. I've no idea if that's true. But some that I've noticed, what I think convinces people to stay, what convinces people to kind of invest essentially time and into these places. One of them is, I think, ubiquity. So this is going to kind of sound slightly tautological, but I think anti-feminism and the far right's wide-spanning presence on almost all forms of social media isn't just a result of its popularity, but also a reason for its popularity. It means that users feel as if they have a wider variety of choices than they do, and contributes to making them feel as if they're, you know, part of a movement, part of something big. Even if large, they all hit on the same kind of narrow ideological themes, the ones that Matthew outlined so perfectly, like just kind of naturalizing inequality and this sort of stuff. The other one is community and belonging. It's a bit of a difficult one, and I sometimes think because it's not quantitatively definable, academics can sometimes underestimate just how important this is. But nearly all of the young men that I have interviewed who are either currently or formerly members of these communities mention feeling out of place. This is the, you know, isolation that Bethan was talking about. They feel out of place and alienated in real life communities, and finding these digital spaces somewhere they feel like they can fit in. And I think one guy once said to me, it feels like the first time I could really talk to other people. And sometimes, especially when lots of these sites are getting closed down due to kind of sustained pressure from pressure groups like Sleeping Giants and things like this, you actually get this almost, you know, this is a hate site, but they say often, the commenters will say very like touching goodbyes to each other, and it becomes quite clear essentially that this has, you know, been more than just kind of like a hate site for them. It's been a kind of sense of community. Finally, and I think this is a really important one, is the very subtle threats that these sites communicate to their audiences. And this is really big, I think, on both the far right and anti-feminist sites. There's an enormous amount of material out there which is dedicated to going into the excruciating detail on the life of people who have not taken, or men mostly, who have not taken the red pill. The phrase from the Matrix used here to mean internalizing the tenets of anti-feminist and far-right philosophy. And these kind of will typically go into their kind of humiliation and subservience at the hands of women, at the hands of Black people, at the hands of, any other group sort of deemed to be kind of inferior, essentially, by that ideology. And it's often described in this language, which was like as unflattering as possible, situations designed to underscore, these other people's, shamefully low social position. And I think they do that in order to provide this menacing reference point for the reader's or the user's undesirable potential if they don't continually revisit and imbibe that ideology. I think, those stories aren't just simply kind of conversion narratives or just people kind of mocking their enemy. I think they're also very subtle threats to their own readership. And this is something, as I say, we see the alt-right replicate often with exactly the same language. Words like beta and cuck and all of this kind of stuff. So I do think it's really important to recognize the kind of significant digital anti-feminist footprint that's been left on the alt-right, not just out of a kind of pedantic need to get the history correct, but because I think fear and resentment towards women remains a really crucial vector of recruitment towards the greater far-right network as a whole. It shapes how the alt-right exists today and is, in what my opinion, distinguishes it from different kind of far-right emergent movements that we're seeing, like QAnon, for example. This research, I think, is also a reminder that the tactics and strategies which are used against feminists are not by any means restricted to those targets, which I think is worth thinking about for people who are interested in kind of building a more progressive society. But as I sort of circling back to what I said in the beginning, I think there is a meta point here, which is in what I try and push when I talk about strategies and influences, that I think we do need to aim to denaturalize a lot of the rhetoric around digital anti-feminism, which kind of makes it sound like it's almost this inevitable organic response to kind of the supposed pressures of modernity and the excesses of feminism and this sort of thing. And I think as campaigns against financial incentives for hate and misinformation demonstrate, because they're really so effective, they're one of the most effective things you can do is essentially take away these group sites' advertising. So I think it does go to show that, like much of online anti-feminist and far-right strategies and popularity, they only work, so to speak, so long as they're profitable, which I think does kind of weaken that kind of argument they often make that this is just a natural backlash, right? I think it kind of often shows that it's actually a bit more sneaky than that. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you very much, Annie. Thank you. I really appreciate the work you do kind of going into these spaces. So you can come back and tell me what you found there and help me understand it. And you've absolutely convinced me about the core significance of anti-feminism in there. But I also think your description of the sort of community stroke, almost kind of slightly cultic nature of belonging to these things is a really important thing to understand. So thank you. I'd now like to go to our final speaker, Alexandra Minna Stern, to pick up some of these issues and give us her perspective from what she's been looking at. Alexandra.
Great, thank you. Thank you to the organizers for today's event and indeed the whole week of events, which I now have registered for now that I actually have found the webpage, which was my own fault that it took me so long to get there, but it's only Tuesday, so I'm in good shape. I've learned so much from the presentations thus far, and I'm going to pick up some of the threads and dive into them a little bit deeper, because I think that some of the points that have been made are just so important to mapping the far right today in digital spaces and in media spaces. So the first is just drawing directly from one of the final points that Annie made, which is not to underestimate the effective nature of digital spaces, not to underestimate the role of community building and the emotional landscapes that are inhabited by social media influencers and followers on the internet. And that is something that I explore in my book, and I explored it both through using literature, very helpful work that's been published in digital studies that looks at affect, which can be quite abstract when you try to look at, kind of read through some of that work. However, you can see I found more specific examples and, clear examples where that was expressed. And so the first is the role of nostalgia. So nostalgia, as we know, is a powerful trope. It's a powerful, effective device that is used in many different ways. We all have probably experienced nostalgia at some forms in our lives. It's something we can understand. And it is a tactic that consciously or unconsciously is employed by far-right media influencers again and again. And so one of them I will mention, and I'm not sharing slides, but I will try to, kind of create a picture for you of what this looks like is, some of you may be familiar with the handle Empress Wife, who is now Vampiress Wife, who was on Twitter, who was thrown off of Twitter, now is very active on Gab. I don't know exactly who this is. I don't think we need to know who these people are. I think we need to know what their effects are and what they're producing culturally and discursively, although in some cases it is helpful to track down who the actual people are. In any case, Vampiress Wife is a great producer of nostalgia in social media. And the way that, let's assume is they do that, is by, kind of using the tools of memification, taking certain stock images. In her case, they are almost always images, and this is pretty US focused. Although with kind of shout outs to kind of this glorified European past, but in the US case, they are Norman Rockwell-like images of happy, suburban, very heterosexualized white communities where men are men, women are women, children are playing softball, girls are helping their mothers in the kitchen, and churches are often in the background, and everything has this very idealized cast to it. So what she will do is use a few of those, and then in terms of the language, kind of the words and the messaging, will include phrases such as, they took everything away from us. We used to have perfect homogenous communities. We used to have this, we used to have that. They have taken it away from us. Now it doesn't, I think we can all figure out who the they is. The they is often Jews, the they is often feminists, the they is often everyone who would be seen as part of this kind of polyglot cabal, which has kind of destroyed, Western society, and prompts them. She will also throw in phrases from some of the intellectual canon of the far right, like Revolt of the Modern World, to Evola and others. So she is just one example I use of this proliferation of kind of nostalgic memes that are doing important, effective work. In addition, I think that, there are other examples of this, and one of them, and I don't know if you're all familiar with it, but there are a few social media influencers that have a very constant presence. They aren't as well known as some of like the key figures like Greg Johnson of Countercurrents, or, now someone like Richard Spencer, who is kind of off to the wayside. But in any case, they are people like, I think it's Jason Kuhn and The Great Order. And they are very much connected to this new enterprise, which was launched a few years ago, called the White People's Quarterly. So they launched the White People's Press, the White People's Quarterly. And what they do is put out what I have never bought it. And this is a struggle that I have, like, do I actually want to pay for this? And sometimes I ask my library to do it and to put it, like, to tag it in the radical right extremism section and put it in the special library. But I've only looked at these online. They do come on print demand, but it is, what they produce is a journal that is all about, the happy face for them of what white identity looks like, finding community, finding self. And in preparing for this presentation today, I was looking over some of the kind of on-demand books that they published. And, I have found recently in particular that white nationalists are producing children's books. So they have done their own version of the Velveteen Rabbit, which is about everything that Annie was just saying in terms of feeling like a misfit, feeling out of place, and actually finding one's authentic or real self through kind of a process of kind of self and collective identification. So for me, these spaces are very important. They might seem quite innocuous to some. if you saw this publication, especially if you didn't see the title of the publication, it would look like, you know, an on-demand quarterly journal with some interesting stories and some good images, but it is doing, I would say, insidious kind of far-right work. So that's one point. Is I think when I stepped into studying the alt-right, I did see the way in which I really kind of frame as a phenomenon of the 2010s. I think the alt-right has kind of come and gone. It still has some tinges. It's useful as a kind of a chronological framing device. But, you know, I did see the ways in which we're engaging in irony and this plausible deniability. It's all really sardonic. It's kind of a bunch of guys shit posting, but it's been much more than that. It's always been much more than that, back to the days of Stormfront, back to the kind of technologies that the white power movement and the Aryan Nation used in the 80s. But I would say more and more this type of nostalgia, it's important for us to track it and to take it seriously. And it also works transatlantically, which is part of, I think, something that's been kind of implicitly kind of stated thus far in the presentations, is that we're talking about a global phenomenon. And particularly when looking at some of the key far right actors in the US, or these influencers, you know, they have a network, and, you know, digital studies scholars have mapped some of those networks that particularly spread into Western Europe and Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and so on. But there are obviously connections too to places like Brazil and India, et cetera. So that's kind of my first point, is really, let's think together about how do we study and how do we understand this effective dimension of the far right on social media. The second that relates to this is the role, and this again goes to Bethan's talk about accelerationism, is the role of dates. So as I was studying the narratives, because the far right, and I'll talk particularly about white nationalists, to write themselves into the future, white nationalists need to create their own historical narrative. And to create their historical narrative, they must rely on dates or, you know, temporal timing of some sort. And what I have found again and again is that dates are doing very important work for the construction of these narratives. And there are key dates, and I know I focus primarily on US history in this regard, dates such as 1790, which is when the Naturalization Act was passed, which basically allowed only white propertied men of fine character to have access to citizenship. That is idealized. It's connected to the nostalgia. Another date would be 1965, which is, I would say, the outsized, most important date. And you will find posts online that just say, everything went to hell after 1965. Why 1965? Because that's when the 1924 Immigration Act, that was based on racial and national quotas, was replaced with the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which moved to family reunification and occupational skills, and set the stage for the arrival, particularly of Latin American and Asian immigrants to the US, and did play a role in changing the demography of the United States. 1965 and what happened in those dates is blamed on the left, on liberals, and specifically on Jews and Jewish legislators who are seen as wanting to manipulate, in a conspiracy-laden way, manipulate immigration laws to change everything to their benefit and to diversify society. And there's also, so there's dates in the past, but there's also dates in the future. And we've already seen some of those dates, 2066, 2083. And a big one that looms relates to my next point, which is the role of demography. So again and again, you will see the date in the US of 2045 or 2050 invoked, because that is the date when the United States, according to census projections, will cease to have, and I'm going to use language that I don't like just for the point of making it, will cease to be a white majority nation. It will become a majority minority nation. And those are the terms that are often used. Now, those terms are incredibly problematic because they are based, they are tied directly to kind of a one drop rule understanding of race in the United States. if there were a broader understanding of race and multiracialism in the United States, there would be no 2045 projection. There would be no panic from their perspective about this kind of looming demographic shift. So I'm very attentive to dates, not just because I'm trained as a historian. Dates are often not very useful as a historian because what you're looking at is broader kind of patterns and over time, but the dates are used strategically to tell a certain story and to invoke the kind of panic that Bethan was talking about. So 2045 or 2050 is used again and again to kind of galvanize this sense of dire demographic catastrophe on the imminent horizon. And then, of course, certain places such as California or Texas will be invoked to say, well, you know, those states in the US have already gotten there. Therefore, then there'll be arguments about why a white ethnostate is needed and so on and so forth. And one of the related to that point about dates is that this is one of the areas where we see mainstream media or liberal media playing into these ideas. There's been some interesting work done by political scientists that have actually showed that when people are primed with dates, white people are primed with dates in understanding kind of shifts in demography in the US, they are more likely to express anti-Latino sentiment or be racist sentiment. And so there's a way in which the dates and the language, which you will find on the front cover of, I think the New York Times is, I don't know if they figured some of this out, but on the cover of, you know, the New York Times and other mainstream media sources. And, you know, after the most recent census was kind of a mess because it happened under COVID and it happened under the Trump administration. But as those numbers are crunched and shared, I think we're going to see more of this being used. And there is this, what I call the erosion zone between kind of, let's say, the far right and the extremism and what is, you know, the mainstreaming of the far right into, you know, liberal media. Left media is usually more astute about this, but not even always. And so, so I think that, you know, keeping that in mind, that dates are crucial, and that is always connected, almost always connected to demographic arguments and demographic panic among the far right. And I'll just close by giving another example of the way in which we're seeing the mainstream of the far right in the US, and that is through the recent wave of transphobic legislation. So in exploring kind of some of the key actors of the alt-right in the 2010s, and let's say the alt-light and the alt-right, so from Jordan Peterson to Gavin McInnes to, you know, Christopher Cantwell or whatever, if you cover that whole spectrum, what you will find again and again is they are all incredibly transphobic. Why are they all incredibly transphobic? That gets to the heart of what Matthew said at the beginning of in his presentation, is that these are about essentialized identities. And, you know, essentialisms, gender essentialisms and racial essentialisms are absolutely central to these ideologies. And even more than homosexuality or gay identity, let's say, where you have a cisgendered person who's attracted to another cisgendered person, we know there are a number of kind of prominent gay men who are part of white nationalism. It's kind of a don't ask, don't tell policy. However, where even those people and the rest of them will come down hard is in terms of gender non-binary identities or trans identities, because they destabilize completely these essentialisms. And so there might be room for some cisgendered identities. Even, you know, we know that part of the kind of men's rights movements includes those who kind of celebrate male affection and kind of male romance as a kind of ultimate expression of male sexuality. And that's been part of the story all the way back to the Nazi era, right? We can track that over time. But in any case, I would say that, you know, I've often said, if you want to kind of push back and counter the far right, you need to be involved in campaigns against transphobia. You need to be calling out transphobia on a regular basis, because that is both, it's both an example and a symptom of the mainstreaming of the far right in the United States. And anyway, I'll stop there. I hope that I've made some connections with the earlier talks, and I look forward to our discussion and questions, etc.
Thank you, Alexandra. No, you definitely did make connections between the talks, so they're already talking to each other, and you helped fill out the picture of both the content and the kind of form of these movements and how they're working. So in a little while, maybe in sort of 10, 15 minutes or so, we'll open up the chat and you can put questions in the chat. When you do that, make sure that you're sending the question either to me directly or to everyone, otherwise I can't see it. Some people put questions to the Reactionary Digital Politics name yesterday and I couldn't see them. But also you can raise your hand if you like, and we'll mix and match how we go about doing things. But before we get there, I just want to kind of provoke some more conversation between our panelists, and maybe I'm going to start with this term that you used, that Alexandra used, about the erosion zone, sort of the point where these movements seem to blend into each other, because I think that's a very interesting and important thing to try and unpack. Though on the one hand, the sort of accelerationist movements that Bethan was showing us might seem very far out on the fringe, kind of isolated groups. And if you say that they're connected to more moderate conservatives, people will accuse you of trying to tar everyone unfairly and so forth. But I think analytically, there seems to me there is a kind of flow and a movement of ideas between groups in a way that hasn't really been present before. And that's because of the way in which the medium we're talking about allows people to access new audiences, but also individuals going online in the way that both Annie and Bethan were describing, to kind of move very easily from some kind of relatively innocent starting point to somewhere else. So I'd like to kind of start by asking Matthew to sort of pick up on that point about the erosion zone, the way these things flow and move between. Is that something you see in your observations? Is there a movement of between movements, as it were, that have been around for a long time, or am I just seeing something that's specific to the internet and is more about ideas and not quite about the way the parties and blocks move? I hope you see what I mean there.
Well, I don't have a thought out answer, so I'll just kind of, offer some thoughts, and I'm sure the other panelists will have valuable things to say as well. I think that it certainly, there's no question that there is interchange and flow between different movements, but I mean, between different currents within the far right, and also between the far right and other political currents to varying degrees. I'm sure that there's an element of that is fostered and facilitated by the internet and by communication technologies that we have today. I'm not sure how much of it we can ascribe to that factor, because I think it is something that's been going on for quite a while. And I mean, when I look at the previous waves of sort of the upsurges of far-right activity in the United States, I think they often reflect a kind of confluence of different currents. So for example, if you look at the upsurge of white nationalist organizing and paramilitary organizing in the 1980s with the Aryan Nations and the Order and a whole set of underground organizations that literally took up arms and declared war on the US government, as well as targeting Jews and African Americans and others. That had very much to do with a convergence of, for example, neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klan groups, which historically had not been friends. They had been very suspicious of each other, but then they started to work together with other related currents. So that confluence, I think, contributed to a kind of dynamism that was one of the factors that gave this kind of upsurge. Similarly, in the 1990s, with the creation of what we now refer to as the Patriot Movement, but was then the militia movement was kind of the standard term, but I see them as the same. People often focus on its roots in the white nationalisms of earlier days. That's an important part of it, but the Christian right was a major additional contributing factor. And again, I see it was this interplay that was tremendously important. I mean, you had important Christian theocratic writers and organizers such as Larry Pratt of Gun Owners of America, who was a Christian Reconstructionist theoretician, advocating formation of militias, and other, Christian right figures advocating militias along with white nationalists. So again, you had this sort of interplay, and there are many current day examples we could point to. I mentioned New Apostolic Reformation and Patriot Movement. I mean, just the way that QAnon and white nationalists have had interplay in a kind of, sort of pan make America great kind of context, the way they've been sort of feeding off each other's, and there's plenty of other examples. I'll stop there. Others can pick up.
Thank you, Matthew. That's great. I wonder if I can come to Bethan to sort of pick that up, and if my questions are too baroque or obscure, just bypass them. But I'm wondering, you showed us the accelerationists, who might look so very removed from how we might imagine the Christian right or the Norman Rockwell America. I mean, so do you see that group as particularly kind of out there and fringy or connected? And I'm also wondering if you could pick up Annie's point about the influencer culture, because it seemed you were partly talking about that, because there's a kind of, they do look like they're speaking to kind of gamer culture and kind of music culture as well. Is that part of what's going on there?
Yeah, no, I think it's really important actually to think about these individuals as not something that happens out over there, like beyond where we are, but really as seeing them as an extension of what we might call mainstream rhetoric. I think people often want to think of it as a problem that's so divorced from anything. It's similar to discussions about whether or not terrorists are insane or not, and mental illness. And we want to sort of otherize individuals who hold ideas that we find repugnant, when in fact, really, we need to be thinking about, well, what in society is doing this and is validating their opinions. And it's a hard thing to say in some ways, but pushing them or making them feel pushed towards believing these things. And so I think there's a concept called the Overton window, which essentially talks about what is within the acceptable sort of political rhetoric in the mainstream. And what we saw in many cases in the last, I would say, half decade is a shifting of the Overton window. So it became more socially acceptable to identify, for instance, to talk about Alexandra's point, to identify a problem if you thought that white people would become a minority in the United States, for instance, or it would be a minority majority country. And so that became more acceptable for many people to articulate, which pushed people to sort of look into more extreme belief systems. It's the same with conspiracy theories. People sort of embrace one that doesn't seem so conspiratorial, and then eventually you get much further in, and those also can shift you towards embracing accelerationism as well. So I think we really need to be careful about arguing that this is something that's divorced from anything mainstream, because while they do have much more extreme ideas than conservatives, that it's not entirely detached. And you do see a number of people who start by hosting certain belief systems that are in the mainstream, and then sort of internalizing them to such an extent that they move further and further. And I think that's really important. And then to your question about influencers, there's a kind of accelerationist influencer culture that goes on there. Especially you're talking about a lot of young people. It's a lot of youth orientated things. So there are people who are prominent artists or creators who are there, figures that you see, YouTubers and others who sort of make their mark that way. I think gaming is part of it as well. It's slightly different insofar as, unlike influencers on mainstream platforms where it's monetized and you see more of their face and their name, this is much less to do with money and much less to do with obvious iterations of power, and much more to do with sort of a way of giving yourself a sense of importance. So it's, your identity is hidden for your protection in many ways, but that also gives you like a secret and some power. And I think that that's really important to think about, is a lot of these people feel like they're not agents in their own life, that they're being obscured and they're being forgotten. And so if they can create this alter ego of sorts that goes out and influences other people. It makes them feel powerful. So in a certain way, we see an influencer culture, but I think it's driven by something different than many of the influencers that you might see on mainstream platforms, who might be doing it for like clout or money. This is much more to sort of feed what I think are a series of personal struggles vis-a-vis feeling isolated.
That's incredibly interesting, and touches on things we heard about last night. We were historian called Mark Sedgwick was talking about the influence of certain kinds of far right, so-called traditionalist thinking, and this self-conception of one as a sort of warrior monk that comes from Julius Evola. And you can see that the way people behave online, as you say, the avatars that can have heroic lives and achieve things, and the way you find these YouTube videos of here is a particular kind of alt-right hero destroys SJW force. That whole language is definitely speaking to that. But I'd like to hear Annie's kind of response to that, actually, this kind of interesting question about the influencer culture and what's working there. One of the phrases we've used in the project or concepts is ideological entrepreneurs, people who kind of found this way to move into these spaces to kind of promote ideas, partly for money maybe, but also able to live and exist, subsist by this kind of promotion. I mean, can you tell us a bit more about that sort of move, or the kind of ambiguous relationship between the kind of grifting part of it, but the kind of using these spaces to create these kind of identities of self that have a certain cultural capital?
Yeah, so yeah, I try not to use the word grifting and grift and stuff like that, purely because I think it sort of slightly misunderstands, I think, the flow of like belief. And I often think, there's a I think there's a Chomsky quote, which I'm just going to bastardize now, which is something about how like it's very hard to convince someone whose job is not to be convinced of something like that. And I sort of think that kind of works for a lot of alt-right influencers as well. And there's quite an interesting thing going on where, we have a bit of a like, it can be easy to get sucked into talking about radicalization as just like this conveyor belt, which like the innocent passive user falls onto, and then they, see the kind of like alt-right influencer and they just become more and more steadily radicalized. But actually what we can kind of see, and what academics like Becca Lewis have done really great work on, is how often it kind of works. The audience and the influencer will work on each other at the same time, and the audience will demand more extreme content and more radical content, and the influencer, whose like income depends on them, has to kind of supply it. And often I think probably what happens is, people often ask me, kind of in my sort of journalistic role, do they really believe it, or are they, just making it up, because they know that it grabs attention. And actually, I tend to think that people will usually believe what makes them the most money. Do they will kind of, I think in this economy, you can convince yourself quite easily into believing what is the most profitable avenue for you to believe. So I try not to use kind of grift, because I think it implies a degree of knowing cynicism, when actually I think, and especially because we talked about before, the lines are so diffused between influencer and audience anyway, it's not always as simple as just kind of like top up and top down, that both of them work on each other usually.
Thank you, Annie. Just to say, the chat is open. Raise your hand if you want to ask questions. I want to come to Alexandra to kind of respond to these remarks, but a question has come in directly to me that I want to kind of put to you, Alexandra, that might help you respond. I think it's just come back to me. Henry, does Henry Price want to ask his question directly, or shall I summarize it for him? He's not appearing. So Henry asks about a seeming contradiction between the kind of the nostalgia that you're talking about, Alexandra, and the kind of anti-feminism, and the accelerationist sort of neo-reactionary wing that wants to kind of push things through. So, and I think that's right, that there is that sense of we want to go back to the 50s, but also we want to destroy everything about America and move through, and therefore kind of rejects a nostalgia that might hold us back from moving to the next kind of stage. I just wonder how you see that contradiction being played out, or if maybe it isn't a contradiction in the way the alt-right movements pass it.
Well, I think if we think about the timescapes that the far right uses, they tend to be cyclical. And so think of something like archaeofuture or retrofuture. Those are actually, you know, those tie together all of the components that you just laid out. It's about getting back to the past to get to the future, but with a certain demographic profile. And, you know, among white nationalists, using the technological tools that, well, according to them, white people invented anyway and should be mobilized for this future, which is at once highly technologized and often eugenic, and also pure and authentic. And so in all that, when Bethan was talking, what you're saying makes a lot of sense in terms of avatars and alter egos and, you know, kind of this, and that connects to the video culture, right? Of it, like it's almost RPG, but tweeting online. At the same time, there's this quest for authenticity. And I find that to be authenticity because, especially in the context of far right and white nationalists wanting to do away with kind of white guilt, which is seen as kind of an affront to authenticity. So this whole idea of what is real and what is authentic, and that relates to another aspect of the movement, which we haven't, or this kind of very heterogeneous movements that we haven't talked about, which is the whole kind of eco-fascist, back to earth element of it, which I think we're seeing more and more of, and is something that I have studied to some extent. I know I think Matthew has looked at this as well, you know, which relates to authenticity, relationship to nature, and the idea of kind of like white domination of nature through this fantastical idea of yet being in harmony with nature and being very ecological, as well as the role of women. Because if you look at, well, where do these kind of tropes of authenticity and realness and kind of, let's say, groundedness come through? They often come through the less well-known but very active female far-right media influencers who are doing things such as, like, you know, the bone broth lady who is talking about the wonders of homeschooling, how important it is to make organic food. You know, there's another one who spends a lot of time packing lunches for her husband when he goes off to work with all organic ingredients. So I think that is, and that is actually an area where I think that, you know, the far right is poised for significant growth, particularly among women. And they're, speaking of the erosion zone, I mean, there's an erosion zone from kind of the mainstream and, let's say, the center right to the far right. But also, you know, it was a very interesting time in 2016 where, you know, there were a good number of Bernie bros, or kind of like white guys who were hell-bent on change in society, who ended up dumping Bernie and going for Trump because they just couldn't deal with Hillary, which relates to the whole anti-feminism part of it as well. So I can't set a jumble of different things, but I guess the upshot of it all is that, you know, let's not forget, let's think about this construction of whiteness and authenticity, how they're related to each other, how those are connected to ideas of kind of purity and community. And you can see the eugenic themes I've studied in the past, like they are kind of anchoring me in a way as I understand what white nationalism looks like today.
Thank you, Alexandra. And I think, again, you touched on something that came up yesterday, that the way in which what might seem like videos about cooking or family life or music and film are often actually ways in which this kind of politics is being communicated. This is the meta-political strategy that was being discussed yesterday, very consciously employed. There's a fantastic question in the chat from Stephen Mayu, which I'm going to come to later towards the end, because I think it raises some really interesting questions. And I'll just at this point go to Saul Newman, so if we can be unmuted. So Saul was with us yesterday. So Saul is a political theory colleague at Goldsmiths in London. Saul, what's your question? You should be able to unmute yourself now. We've given you the power.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for that. So, I mean, one of the points that Angela Nagel makes in her book "Kill All Normies," which is, you know, a study of alt-right internet subcultures, is that, you know, the alt-right has managed to kind of basically effect a kind of a very successful cultural revolution where they managed to position themselves on the side of, you know, freedom, transgression, free speech, for instance, which was always, in a way, the kind of the province of the left. Certainly the kind of the May '68 left, and the left is now on the side of political correctness and prohibition and sort of a certain kind of moral prudishness actually. So I guess my question is, what how can the left respond to this kind of sort of ideological deadlock that it now seems to be caught in? Does it need to kind of somehow reclaim the space of free speech? I mean, of course, the alt-right doesn't really believe in freedom at all. It's kind of a weaponization of freedom. It means freedom for them, but not for other people. But nevertheless, that they've somehow managed to kind of claim that space of freedom and transgression and provocation, and whereas the left is just kind of caught up in this kind of sort of moral sort of prudishness and a kind of moral puritanism and conservatism, which I regard as being a kind of a complete sort of dead end, actually, as far as left-wing politics go. So what can the left do? How can the left kind of reclaim this space of free speech and freedom in a kind of a politically effective way?
Thank you, Saul. Who wants to volunteer to take on
It's
this?
For anyone, open question.
I'm looking at all of you, waiting for someone to step forward to address the kind of answer. I mean, maybe Annie, can I invite you to come in on the question about the Nagel analysis? Because I know you've written about that in the past. I mean, firstly, this kind of point about the Nagel analysis, so that's part of what's happened. How much do we kind of agree with that? But then also this next question about how the alt-right has made itself, this again came up yesterday, made itself appear to be the counterculture, and that's sort of part of its influencer appeal, isn't it? That it's the kind of exciting, kind of punky thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for one thing, I hesitate a bit to sort of take the alt-right at their word when they kind of, and I think you were speaking to this as well, Saul, this kind of idea, we're the kind of party of revolt, we're the kind of like libertarian sort of
it's complete bullshit.
Yeah, and so I almost like, it's almost kind of like a framing that I sort of always have to reject, because and especially I think now that you're seeing this kind of Christian supremacist sort of line that seems to be kind of rising through it. And it seems that actually they're kind of discarding that kind of anarchic libertarian sort of like aesthetic very quickly, which I guess reveals, as you and I both suspected, it was never all that important to them anyway. In terms of how like we as the left tackle it, I think it is a really interesting question. I think, the left do really need to have a very firm commitment to free speech, and I think that was it was a big mistake in sort of like letting however sort of like disingenuously them kind of sort of take that mantle, but also I think it's people are able to understand a kind of more nuanced version of free speech, right? Like people are like perfectly capable of understanding how like one person's speech can impinge on another person. Do you know? Like it's often kind of made to seem like a very kind of academic argument, but I don't really think it is. I think it's something that people are perfectly capable of understanding, that like, for instance, if you have someone, who's kind of preaching violence, or a kind of, preaching about kind of, I suppose the, let's say like, kind of like the kind of inherent immorality of like homosexuality or something like that, that is something that kind of creates a kind of like a culture of sort of like violence and that kind of thing. So it seems like something that people are capable of understanding, and it should, I think, be called out as a kind of false, a sort of false premise, I suppose, that kind of the whole free speech argument is being made upon, I think. But I feel like I've only answered like a tiny bit of your question. But yeah,
that's a good response.
Annie, I think we'll probably come back round and touch these issues again in different kind of ways, or certainly across the week as well. But Leda, Ravina has been waiting very patiently to ask a question. So Leda, please tell us what you're thinking about.
Oh, thank you for such an interesting debate. Actually, there are a lot of Albanian students and lecturers in the world. I guess I'm the only one considering the names of the participants, so just let me tell you very briefly. When we talk about ideology, we mean different things when we say left and right. So in the, I'm an Albanian national, I've been studying in Italy, I'm in Hungary for the moment. So when in Albania we say left, we related it with communist dictatorship. Actually, we don't have a far left, and for sure we have never had an anarchy group in Albania. And so when I listen about the right and fascism, usually in Europe is related with fascism and Nazism and what happened in the Second World War. So I will not go so much further in time, but in another continent, I will just stay in mine. Italy and Greece are very interesting cases of very active far-right groups. And I can say, and we can see and confirm that after January the 6th, what happened in the Capitol assault can be proved that the online rhetoric have some very offline consequences. But what happened in Greece with the Golden Dawn movement, for example, that had also their representatives in the European Parliament, was not just thinking in the academic level what to do with this far-right narrative, how to create space for a counter-narrative. They just put a legal framework and just considered this movement illegal. They got arrested, the leaders, even in the European Parliament. So I'm very shocked to see, and I'm saying that from a country that is just doing some reforms and just have a very European Union perspective, and maybe the most pro-European and pro-American country in the world. But as we have trainings from Europeans and Americans of how to become democratic, I'm just shocked and appalled to see why nobody reacts legally to what it's expressively fascist. So as long as the discussion about it is like a reflection on the media, a reflection on a website, a reflection in the conference, nothing can be resolved. So what I can see is this kind of very active and persistent far left, especially online, and then a very indolent and passive, moderated, I can't say moderated left, I'm just saying moderated people, common sense people. So just my question is, what kind of legal frame do you seek that can limit and make this this violent extremist accountable? I'm sure that in online media you cannot take a legal action against everyone who reads and shares and likes, but just taking the case of the Golden Dawn far right movement in Greece, if you make accountable the leaders of this movement, it's much easier to manage all the rest. Thank you.
Thank you. So there's a question about sort of the politics and responses to these things, and we're talking about the kind of cultural, political, digital strategies here. You know, what are the kind of, you know, is it appropriate to think in terms of the legal dimensions of regulation of kind of radical and far right movements? Now, I don't know which of our speakers wants to take that sort of question. I'm sort of.
I'll start off.
Yes, please do.
I mean, I can't answer that all because that was a really big question, and I think it speaks to. I'm seeing some comments in the chats about chat about. That's why it's so important we all come together, because this is a global phenomenon and we need mapping strategies that can be very broad-based, but also sensitive enough to understand the different political histories of countries, whether Albania or India, or I've been kind of watching closely what's happening in China with the large-scale detention of the Uyghur population, which has not really fallen into this conversation, but I would put on the general kind of, you know, demographic control kind of framework that is part of this discussion. But, you know, I think one of the kind of aspects, just speaking to the US, is that, you know, when the alt-right was kind of building up its networks, its meme strategies, its community, from like 2008-ish. I mean, in a way, there's very connected to the Barack Obama's election in 2008. Things take off, the term is coined, things take off in the 2010s. You know, those at the kind of forefront of it went full force with embracing these meta-political strategies, which involved, you know, basically, okay, we're going to be the counterculture. We're going to take from Gramsci. We're going to take from, you know, all of the ideas that had been articulated by the French New Left in the 60s and 70s. So they basically, like people like Greg Johnson would say, you know, we don't want political power. I mean, they did want political power, but we want to kind of change culture. Politics is downstream from culture, that whole idea. And then Trump was elected, and in a way it threw everything for a total loop, because that's not what they were expecting. I mean, everyone was surprised when Trump was elected, and then things shifted around again. So I think like to Matthew's points, I don't know if Matthew, if you have any other thoughts about where we are now that we've come to the Biden presidency and what happens with both the ongoing threats and the residual aspects of kind of being in the post-Trump era. So I would say that's one point I wanted to make. And the other point, I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh, well, that I would say this has to be a multi-pronged strategy from the left. So on the one hand, if we're talking about specific organizations that have leaders, like in the US, you know, there's the Oath Keepers, there's the 3%ers. Those groups have leaders. They have, you know, kind of central leaders. They have, you know, kind of chapter leaders. Those people can be identified through, you know, kind of legal, through different legal mechanisms and through surveillance and oversight, you know, if the state wants to do so or other NGOs are involved in that, and they can be taken to task legally. When you talk about those, what this panel is focused on more, which is the digital domain, things become so much more slippery. And so, you know, I think of this as like a series of, you know, this is about distributed networks of discourse and knowledge. They're really, and that's one of the weaknesses of this. It's also one of the strengths because it can be ubiquitous. And so I don't have an answer there. I'm going to stop before I, you know, but I do think, how do we, you know, regulation itself is not just going to do it, because we've seen that even when social media companies, you know, and platforms have done regulation, it does have some effect, like taking Trump offline did have an effect. However, you know, there is, especially when there are these kind of gray areas and when there's a lot of nodding and winking going on with far right memes, you know, regulation is just not going to cut it. So it requires new types of strategies that are attuned to our evolving digital kind of ecosystems.
Thank you. Matthew, did you want to come in on this question?
Yes, thank you. And I wanted to, first of all, thank Leida, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but I think that your first of all, your point was very well taken, that we're not just talking about discourse in a digital context, we're talking about events that take place in, you know, in physical interactions. People are being killed. I mean, people are being hurt. People are being terrorized. This is not just about words or images. Words and images are fueling that. So it's not that the words or images are unimportant, but we need to keep that larger context in mind. I did want to speak to the question about, you know, what kind of legal strategy would work here. And I guess I want to go back to a point that I made at the end of my talk, which is that I am very wary of the danger of anti-far right organizing and anti-fascism fueling state repression. I mean, I will only speak about my own, you know, the state that the government that I live under, the United States. But I think it applies more broadly. I think one of the terrible things about the far right on a lesser scale is that it makes, you know, mainstream and so-called moderate forms of authoritarianism and bigotry and oppression look okay by comparison. I mean, the United States government has done terrible, terrible crimes to its own population and to people around the world. And I think that I'm extremely wary of looking to that government to crack down on far-right movements. You know, we've seen the kind of things that the FBI has done. We've seen the kind of things that Homeland Security has done, putting people in cages and so on. These are not agencies that I want to give greater power to crack down on political opponents, even if they're people on the right. There's a long history in the United States of laws being passed ostensibly to target the right being used much more heavily against the left and against oppressed communities. That doesn't mean that there are, you know, never circumstances where we should use the courts or, you know, use the state in order to protect people. I don't want to be absolutist about that. But I think in strategic terms, that would be the wrong thing to put the focus on. So.
Thank you, Matthew. So since we're on this issue of strategy, and we have a question in the chat about sort of rhetorical strategies, I'm going to come to, I presume Stephen Mayu is the rhetorician Stephen Mayu, who by coincidence I recommended to someone on Twitter today. So Stephen, would you like to ask your question and give us your thoughts? You were asking about kind of the rhetorical strategies for dealing with the kind of redrawing these boundaries in political life. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Those were extraordinary talks that got me. I'm in the middle of writing a paper for the Kenneth Burke Conference, a rhetorician in the United States, and it makes me want to just totally rewrite the paper in light of those 4 talks. But my question is this, and it's a delicate one that I'm somewhat hesitant to bring up, but you've made me think that this is a good time to do it. At a certain point, I think it was Alexandra had mentioned trans and the complications that one wants to rhetorically engage in order to complicate the essentialist oppositions. And so I think that's, and in that particular context, I really understand how one would want to do that. But as we think about complicating the oppositions and the borders that separate those oppositions, we want to be self-conscious about something that you may, I think it was Matthew made clear to us here, and everybody else reinforced it, is that one of the rhetorical results that had political consequences of the Trump presidency was the way that his images and his rhetoric made us want to problematize the notion of borders. But what you pointed out was that what his presidency did was make more permeable the border between the mainstream and far-right politics. And so in this case, do we not want to have rhetorical strategies to reestablish that border? And if we do, does that contradict or at least make more problematic our rhetorical strategies where we are trying to make certain literal and figurative borders more permeable?
Thank you. That's a complex question, but I think I can see you're hitting on something very significant there. How does one respond to these movements in a sense where one is defending a sort of pluralism and an open unfolding of the democratic space of the American or British polity, and then at the same time kind of institute some kind of line that says, well, this no longer belongs here. So how do we create those kinds of the rhetorics, but also the spaces and places? Does anybody want to step in and tackle that sort of question? We appear to have lost Beth, I'm afraid, but hopefully she'll find her way back in. But Alexandra, did you want to kind of pick up on these kind of issues or themes?
I'm continuing to mull over the question, so give me a minute. I mean, my starting point is that I think your question is really a very interesting one. To me, it's operating in 2 different registers. One is the register, and I need to figure that out. So give me a minute, and I'm gonna.
But I think it also speaks to what Matthew was just saying about, how the risks of kind of instituting too strong a border between the prescribed and the non-prescribed, these can kind of harm the polity, that we end up kind of instituting systems of law or rule that give the state power to kind of define what's in and out rather than the people. So in that, it's a very an age-old kind of question. Annie, do you want to help us out?
I'm going to have a crack at it. Yeah. So I think I don't think it would be kind of desirable to sort of like put up a border and say, conservatism stops here, now you're kind of, and far rightism begins here, this is appropriate and this is inappropriate. I don't think it would be desirable because I don't think it would be effective particularly. I think, there can be a real problem in a way where you almost feel like watching, social media platforms and you kind of, all of these sorts of sites which like try and respond to these kind of, movements, to vaccine misinformation, to, the alt-right, to QAnon. It almost feels almost as if they're kind of playing whack-a-mole in a way or something like that, because it almost feels as if, the minute you kind of prescribe one, then another one will kind of rise up in its kind of place. And this is sort of a bit what I was talking about when I was sort of saying, it's not necessarily an organic kind of backlash, it's strategic, right? It's kind of, it's responding and learning and evolving based on kind of the current conditions. And so I kind of think, it's maybe a bit of a downer in a way, but like a lot of this kind of radical right politics will probably be here to stay for some time, because it's responding to things like economic insecurity and a kind of a sort of fear of kind of like change and kind of loss of privilege and all these kind of things, which aren't really going to go away. So in a way, we'll kind of try and keep on sort of responding to whichever kind of iteration it finds itself in this time, but it will only ever kind of be, I think, a temporary effect. And I think this spoke to my answer to Saul as well, talking about how the far right was quite happy to be sort of libertarian and pro free speech, but they can just as easily ditch that the minute it's not convenient, the minute it's not sort of effective anymore. So we can kind of draw up essentially these kind of like permeable boundaries. But yeah, I suppose my dark prediction is that they will just find a way to get around that. Do you know?
I mean, I think it's one way to think about this, that I mean, borders go both ways. And part of what you said, Annie, and what Bethan said as well, and we heard in the talks, was how kind of people with different kinds of issues or concerns or problems kind of become drawn in. So other issues about how do we allow people in to other kinds of ways of doing democratic politics that don't draw them down these routes. And
yeah, so I think that's the sort of boring answer, is that you kind of like
that's rhetorical.
Not saying you were being boring, more just like that was the kind of the basic thing I didn't want to say.
In the UK, for example, one way of understanding British politics right now is a certain kind of attempts by some to racialize Englishness in the context of a certain kind of English nationalism taking shape, to make that racial rather than civic. And that's such a trap, because if one then kind of rejects that and calls people who express their nationhood racist, you actually affirm that connection between race and nation. So how do you then create rhetorically spaces where people can articulate or express or perform or whatever their sense of nationhood in non-racial ways? So how do you kind of allow that in, and simultaneously kind of defy some things while allowing some things to happen? It's extremely complicated political strategic question that I don't think people are kind of good at doing, and does also speak to Saul's question: how does one, at the same time as wanting to institute rules and regulations to protect people, not allow that to be taken up, so that one is presented as kind of the one who is instituting the borders and closing things down? Alexandra, did you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I've been mulling this over, and I appreciate Annie's response and your further commentary. And I would say that, I mean, in a way, what you've done, Stephen, is define a catch-22 that we're in, because with Trump, what you had was such braggadocio, such kind of, he was constantly transgressing in a way that his followers loved and that was exciting to them, and pushing those boundaries, as you said, pushing those boundaries, while at the same time wanting to build a wall, like all of that. But one of the issues is if the response to that is that, well, we need more civility, or, for example, at my university, there's a big focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion and things like that, which is seen by the far right as like having, for example, having people using pronouns, gender pronouns, as seen as like, an absolute kind of example of, of kind of the fact that from their perspective, left or liberal culture has won the day and is reshaping things. So anything that from like my perspective might be a progressive approach or a kind of course correction will be seen by them as, you know, kind of the further evidence of kind of the takeover of, you know, American society by, you know, kind of Marxist Bolsheviks, cultural. Well, now the whole thing is about critical race theory. None of them even know what critical race theory is. Critical race theory is basically intersectionality with some race and feminism thrown in, but it's become it's the latest, forget cultural Marxism, now it's critical race theory, and then there'll be something else new. So I guess that, you know, we would need another session to really think our way through this catch-22. But I do think it is caught up too in the ways in which, like, there are different registers, and that's what I was getting at, like policy, ideology, cultural discourse space, social media. How are those connecting to one another? And there are pressure points where we can intervene, but doing so has to be done with a great deal of kind of thought and forward thinking, because anything has the potential to backfire, if that makes sense. So this is not a happy response either, but I think that this is part of the diagnosis of our current predicament. And I do think as we come out of COVID and people are together again in IRL, in real life, I'm very concerned. Many people in this country have guns. Many of them are badly behaved. Many of them have become, you know, far right mobilized. And so, you know, it's going to be a very interesting summer here in the US. Hopefully none of that will, you know, nothing, terrible things have already happened and more terrible things hopefully won't come to pass. But, you know, I think this kind of reentry post-COVID, which is a whole other aspect that we didn't anticipate in the context of far-right mobilization, which has added an unfortunate layer of amplifying conspiracy theories and kind of orienting, you know, social relations is, you know, that's another kind of question mark that's hanging over all of us, I think.
Thank you. So it's 10 to the hour, and I'm going to kind of steer you into the home straight and invite each of our panelists to sort of make concluding remarks or pick up on things you didn't get the chance to say, or excuse me, some of the questions in the chat. Bethan's responded to some, but there's a couple of questions along a very interesting point here in response to Stephen Mayu that raises this question: where are the left's bone broth ladies? And George Edwards asked me that directly as well. What are the examples of online rhetoric and usage that counter this kind of stuff very well? Hang on. And there are also questions about international dimensions. So who would like to go first? Go ahead, Matthew.
I just want to offer a point that was kind of a little bit touched on earlier, but not so much a focus. Several of the my fellow presenters addressed the question of what's the motivation, or what is it? What's the appeal of the digital far right, or far right online communities and so forth? And several people talked about the kind of feeling of isolation that many people, and particularly men, feel who are attracted to these spaces. And I think that's important. It's sort of the sense of community that is provided, or whether it's a real community or just sort of an illusion, it's another question, but that feeling of community. I want to just offer another little piece of sort of the picture in terms of motivation, which is in terms of power, and in terms of this sort of the social hierarchy. I mean, I have often looked at the dynamics of right-wing movements as fulfilling kind of a double-edged kind of political role. On the one hand, they speak to the sense of people feeling that the historical privileges and power that they've held are under threat from below, but also feeling disempowered by elites, real or imagined, above them. And so it's sort of this sense of being squeezed from two directions that I think you see reflected in a lot of the kind of ideologies expressed in the far right. And so that's it. I just wanted to sort of put that thought in here.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely right. Thank you very much. Annie, would you like to wind up or say anything else or respond to anything in the chat?
Yeah, I've got like this really interesting question, which I keep on losing, which is, sorry, bear with me, where I try and find it. It's about South Africa and the kind of white genocide, I think. Anyway, I just wanted to say that that's a really interesting question, if I could find it. Oh yeah, so it says, have you considered how right-wing talk is different in the global south and settler colonial spaces such as Brazil and South Africa? I found it interesting how global right discourse such as white genocide are mobilized in South African right-wing discourse, not in relation to immigrants, but to interpret general social problems such as crime as an ominous black threat. And that really hit on something that I've been thinking about a lot in the past few days, because I saw a annoying tweet, which was something about how people overblow the kind of significance of the international far right because none of the Capitol rioters, as far as we know, were anything but domestic, which was a very like US-centric point of view, I thought, and very annoying. And actually, I've been kind of thinking about how, what this has been one of the biggest impacts, actually, and almost one that we understand so implicitly that we never even like bring it up, or I certainly fail to bring it up, how internationalized the far right has become as a result of kind of as a result of digital spaces and digital networking. And it really rang a bell in me, that mention about white genocide, because I remember that Lauren Southern, who's a Canadian far right influencer, did a whole documentary about the supposed white genocide that's happening in South Africa, which was, I think, a way to kind of introduce the white genocide that she said was happening in white Africa. I'm not implying it's real at all. But yeah, and it was a way to introduce, essentially, I think, domestic viewers to this kind of international sort of far right solidarity, which has often, I think, been something that the far right are very jealous of the left for having, international kind of solidarity, and they want to mimic that. But it was also, I think, it was about a way of kind of universalizing, whiteness, making it all this kind of like, it's this effort to make whiteness this single international concept, which of course we know it's like never been, that is completely contingent on all sorts of things within nations and within borders and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess, thank you, Alette, for giving me that question, because I think it reminded me that I hadn't mentioned something very important about how digital politics have changed the far right. So thank you.
Thank you, Annie. No, that's absolutely excellent. Spot on point. It's definitely one of the things that one sees. Alexandra.
Yeah, I mean, I was planning on saying one thing, but I want to respond to what Annie was talking about in terms of constructions and definitions of whiteness. It's very interesting to go back to in the US context, the 1920s, where whiteness, kind of idealized pure whiteness was Nordic. It was Nordic, Anglo-Saxon, Scot, but Nordic supremacy was how it was defined by Madison Grant and others. Fast forward to today, and you can see that, through kind of historical processes and various things, whiteness has expanded, so that you have people like Faith Goldie, who's another Canadian, and there's a lot of Canadian far righters that we haven't talked about, but they have played an important role. I think she identifies as like a Hungarian Catholic. So kind of Central, Southern, Eastern Europe, in a way, has become almost like the United Nationsization of kind of whiteness in this kind of far right identity. So, and there are people who are, now with the rise of recreational genetic testing and ancestry testing, that is also being invoked in people's definition of whiteness. So I think that's a really important point, to kind of keep tracking how that is shifting, even in a context where in the US, we still have the predominance of the one drop rule, and how that is playing out in these demographic conversations. And I guess the point I'd want to close with is, one of the reasons I titled my book Proud Boys in the White Ethnostate was not because I was so interested in understanding everything about the Proud Boys, but because I wanted to kind of underscore how misogyny and anti-feminism, which Annie and others have talked about, is absolutely essential to the far right. There is understandably a lot of focus on racism, on xenophobia. However, the whole package in this essentialized and naturalizing way, you know, is very reliant on and continually amplifies kind of the anti-gender and the anti-feminism, which then relates to more globally, you know, what is going on in places like Poland and Hungary. And if you think of also in Brazil and Bolsonaro, who is, you know, just could not be more of an anti-feminist and a homophobe and a transphobe and everything else. So I guess that is something, a conversation for another day, more to think about the kind of interconnections between the let's call it the anti-genderism, which is a term that's used by my friends who are scholars working in Poland to describe the current moment, connects to the Catholic Church, a range of other things. So I just want to put in kind of underscore the importance of always foregrounding the role of kind of sexism and misogyny in the context of the far right.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Well, look, I started by saying there couldn't be a better panel. It was going to be great. I think my promise of greatness was fulfilled. And I think you saw what this really was, an absolutely excellent panel of people to have talking to us about these issues. I'm sorry we didn't get to pick up on all the questions. There's just so much to discuss. So I want to thank my colleagues on the research project, Rob Topinka and Cassian Osborne-Carey. I particularly want to thank Rob Gallagher, who's been behind the scenes making the whole thing work technologically. I want to thank the participants for coming, Matthew, Annie, Alexandra and Bethan. You've all been absolutely fantastic, and everyone else for being in the audience and for their questions. Join us the same time tomorrow, 5 o'clock UK time, when my colleague Rob Topinka will be chairing a discussion on the rhetoric and aesthetics of these kinds of movements. It's going to be just as excellent as it was today. And then come back on Thursday and come back on Friday. And at the end, maybe we'll find some way to all get together and carry on talking and sorting this out. Just enough time, we'll be able to do it. But thank you very much, everyone. And thank you for your time. And please have a good night.